Thank you, Ignacio, for that very generous introduction. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today with all of you to share some work. I wouldn't call it complete, but it's still close to being complete. Just to give you a background as to this paper, because it's part of a larger project. And this project, the kickoff for this project was this expert group meeting, which was convened by the UN Women and the ILO in Istanbul last year. So there were about 20 of us at that meeting, where we were basically discussing issues around engendering fiscal space. And the backdrop to this is the general economic crisis and the sharp rise in interest rate that took place after COVID in the United States and so on. So how that has posed challenges to low income and middle income countries in terms of raising resources for development, sustainable development, how that would affect their progress or the lack thereof towards sustainable development goals. So this was the overall focus of the expert group. And from there, a few of us were assigned responsibility to take the project to the next step. And that involved three of us, three teams rather. The first one was Stephanie Sagino from University of Vermont, who wrote about macro dimensions, domestic macro dimensions of financing and for gender equality. And Eileen Grable from Denver, she looked at the external constraints on financing development and gender equity development. And then I would say that me and my co-authors listed on the slide, analysis and Tom Masterson, were given the kind of like the engineering task. That is, okay, we can suggest each policy, we can propose these ideas to invest in particular initiatives for gender equality or particular methods of financing them. But what is going to be the modeling framework to assess them, compare trade-offs and so on? So that was the goal of ours. So as it stands now, there is a report that is going to be released at the UN headquarters in New York, I think sometime later this month or in early November. And it's called Engendering Fiscal Space. And it's a policy framework for financing for gender equality. So what I'm presenting you today is going to be included in that report, and that's the larger context of the research that I'm presenting. The work is still in a somewhat of a draft stage. I have a draft paper. I was hesitant to circulate it because some of this is, when you have three co-authors, there are disagreements between them, and we have to agree about certain way of phrasing certain things or formulating certain propositions and so on. So, but it's almost, I would say, 90-95% complete. For those of you who are interested, please shoot me an email. That's where my email I'm easy to find on the internet, and I'd be happy to share the paper. But right now, the women has embargoed, so that's why I'm uncertain. Okay, so now to this presentation. So, like I was just said, the main idea is to develop a policy model, which is a comprehensive policy tool for impact assessment that is based on heterodox and feminist economic perspective. So we're coming from a different place than the standard way of looking at it is based on gender equilibrium theory, especially specifically computable gender equilibrium model. So now we start from the premise. Our starting point is that different initiatives for gender equality will have different effect on various metrics of gender equality, such as differentials in employment, for example. Alternative policies are also for the same amount of government expenditure, the same like $1 million of expenditure, they are expected to create different impacts on macroeconomic equities, like the trade balance or the tax revenue. Further, alternative methods of finance is initiated, whether, say, for example, they're financed by domestic resource mobilization or through external borrowing. That also has distinct macroeconomic impacts, right? So, in sum, The idea is that alternative initiatives for gender equality and alternative financing models or methods should be analyzed jointly. So that's the framework from which we are starting. So our basic idea is to produce an evaluation metrics of, say, cost and benefits and potential trade-offs. So I don't know whether people can see this from here, but the general idea is that if you look at that table, the two columns, the big column there labeled A and B, represent like two policy initiatives, and an element of that matrix shows the impact of a method of financing a policy initiative. So the policy initiatives are the ones that are the A or B, and then each row is showing different methods of financing, and each column is showing a different outcome. So I know it's hard to read, but if you, the rows are basically saying, like, say, for example, you finance the policy initiative A using domestic borrowing, right? And then the columns are telling you what will be its effects on the GDP growth rate, on unemployment rate, and a few other fiscal deficit, the external balance, and then some aggregates, which, I mean, some outcomes which are differentiated along gender lines, like the employment outcomes, then the poverty, which is looking at the distributional aspect, and so on. So that's the idea. So our idea is basically to produce a model or create a model from which policymakers or political evaluations of different policies, not just for policymakers, but also for collective action for civil society organizations, to assess different methods in conjunction with the different methods of financing them and look at its differentiated effects on outcomes, macroeconomic outcomes, and distributive outcomes. Distributive outcomes with a specific focus on gender equality. So that's the general idea. Now, let me just give you a kind of a skeleton of the flow chart of the model. And so we start with the intervention, a policy intervention, which is really a combination of a policy initiative and how to finance it. So it could be, for example, improving the physical infrastructure in a country, say, like Tanzania, where women and girls spend a large amount of time collecting water in rural areas. Right? So a particular initiative may be improving the physical infrastructure in that country. And we could look at it in combination of financing it through domestic resource mobilization, say, by raising tax revenue. So that's the way that we specify an intervention. So a simulation run will typically begin with specifying the nature of the policy initiative. And then the first block is really looking at the macroeconomic effects of that. So the impact on GDP, as well as the financial balance of the domestic private sector and the external sector. So the next block kind of extracts the changes in what are called in this type of modeling as the linkage variables. So these are the variables for which we are tracking changes at the macro level, but they're called linkage variables because this is what is connecting the macro level to the micro level, right? So those, this particular illustration is employment, household expenditure, and income, right? So from here on, we are in a kind of a micro domain, if you will. So the changes in employment, the individual changes in the time spent on employment is modeled next, followed by changes in individual earnings, right? And adding up changes for individuals' earnings will give us the changes in household income. And from there, changes in household expenditures, right? And then the result of that is the change in inequality in the distribution of earnings or distribution of household income or expenditures, and that can be derived from the model. Then the other kind of element of this flow chart is that the intervention itself is expected to produce a direct effect. Again, going back to the example of spending money on improving physical infrastructure, the improvement in the quality of road, accessibility, that can really mean reduction in the time that women spend on collecting water or firewood. And so that will have a direct effect at the individual level on the time spent on household. And in turn, the changes in how time spent on household production is also affected by how employment rates of women change and men change, and how earnings change, because we believe that one critical determinant of how household production is divided in the household is bargaining power between the sexes, which is shaped to a considerable extent by relative earnings of men and women. So what we're modeling as part of the macro outcomes, the micro impacts of the macro outcomes, we also relate to how that affects the division of domestic labor, non-paid labor, right? So in turn, this will have effects on what we call as individual and household time deficits. This is really a measure of how individuals and households are deprived in their ability to care for their dependents, like children and elderly, and take care of their own household responsibilities, keeping a clean living space, doing other stuff that makes a home make a house or a place of dwelling into an actual home, right? That's what that goes into it. So those effects are also modeled. So that leads to changes in time deficits is presumed to lead to changes in time poverty status, which in our view has effects on or implications for income poverty. So that's the next loop in the model. And then going in the other directions, the changes in earnings, from there we can assess the changes in gender gaps in employment, earnings, poverty, and unpaid work. So as you see that what we have here is a sketch of the flow chart of the model, which is translating a particular intervention specified as a combination of a policy initiative and a financing method to a set of like macro and microeconomic outcomes. So that's the overall flow chart of the model. But now let me get into the details. The macro block of the model is building on the work of the late Bin Godley, who used to be my colleague at the Levy Economics Institute, and also the other colleagues who work on the macroeconomic team at the Levy Institute. So, like all SFC models, there is a strong causal part, like what is the causality in the model. I'll come to that a little bit later in the presentation, but first I want to highlight what may not be familiar to some of you, is that SFC models are built on a watertight accounting system of 4 interrelated matrices. That's actually a very distinguishing feature of the approach. So the first part of it is a social accounting matrix. Then that basically represents the flow of commodities and money across industries and institutional sectors. And then there is a flow of funds matrix, which is displaying the sources and uses of funds for each institutional sector. Then there is a revaluation matrix, which is depicting the changes in the market value of real and financial assets due to changes in their market prices. And finally, we have a balance sheet matrix, which is then summarizing how the stocks of assets, real and financial assets held by various institutional sectors are impacted by the policy initiative. Now, looking at the SAM, here is a portrayal. It's basically recording the flows of commodities and money across industries and institutional sectors. So production, that's the first row there, and IP represents intermediate purchases. So that's usually disaggregated using input-output table. So when we have done this previously in some modeling parts, it's usually disaggregated to the full, like if the input-output table has 83 industries, we will disaggregate it to 83 industries. But often for analytical purposes, we will drastically reduce the number of sectors to say 5 or 6 or whatever. Right? So that's then disaggregated using the IO table. There's basically adding a column and row for each industry for intermediate purchases, the IP symbol there. Then corresponding disaggregation is also carried out for the total wage bill, which is represented by the symbol WBH there in the second row of the matrix in the first column. And the gross operating surplus of enterprises, not financial businesses, which is the third row, of the first column and net indirect taxes of the government. And also we do a similar disaggregation for foreign and domestic demand. Now, the household sector is disaggregated by a representative sample of the population rather than representative agents. Right? And we'll come to this point a little bit later on. But when we discuss the micro part of the model. Now, what is clear from the table is that each variable there represents a transaction between two sectors that occurs over the accounting period. Now, people who are adherents of the stock flow consistent method, they point out that the table is incomplete because it does not carry through the logical implication of this principle of double entry accounting, right? For example, what form does the savings of the household sector take? That's not clear here. Where do they go? How are budget deficits financed? You don't have any explanation of that. So most of the neoclassical policy models that I just mentioned, the computable general equilibrium models, by and large, just take into account the SAM. In other words, they ignore the stock implications of macroeconomic fluctuations or policy initiatives. I will not go into the details of the flow of funds metrics and the revaluation metrics. The flow of funds metrics, just to specify briefly, it's capturing, as the name itself indicates, capturing the financial flows between sectors. So the logical question, once we have considered the flow of funds metrics, is like, what are the results of this? These are like transactions, right? For borrowing and liability, borrowing and lending, and borrowing across sectors. So what happens? That's the result of this. Naturally, to complete that, we need to explicitly bring stocks into the analysis. That is, stocks of assets and liabilities into the picture. In other words, we need to link borrowing and lending, right? Or more generally, all the entries in the flow of funds matrix to the stocks and assets of liability. In doing so, we also need to consider the changes in the market value of real and financial assets. That's what is usually represented in a revaluation matrix. Now we'll jump right into the balance sheet matrix here that displays then the results of the initial stocks, the intersectoral financial flows, and revaluation. So here we are looking at an example with 10 asset liability categories and 6 institutional sectors. I really apologize for the choice of the phones here because I guess maybe the size of the room, the visibility is pretty bad. So apart from real capital, other categories are all financial assets and liabilities. So let me just summarize for you what's really going on. So we have distinguished between domestic and foreign components of loans, equities or shares, and other securities. And also, except for real capital, the row sum of each category adds up to 0 because each financial asset of an institution is the liability of another institution and vice versa. So the inclusion in the model of the stocks, in the model of the stocks of assets and debt allows for tracking the implications for expenditure and saving decisions, as well as for endogenizing the income transfers that are generated by interest payments on existing debt. So that's the broad idea behind doing this. I'll skip through this in the interest of time, which basically shows what may be evident to not many macroeconomists in this room, of the identity that links gross financial, gross capital formation to the terms on the right side, to the acquisition of financial assets. But I'll jump to what is more relevant really when we think about what we are trying to look at here, right? We're looking at financing for development with the gender equitable flows, right? So the consequence of the accounting structure of the model that leads to these 3 balance equation, which basically says that the sum of the net acquisition of financial assets, that's the NAFA, and the public sector's borrowing requirements, that's the PSBR, and the current account balance, and the sum of that adds up to 0, right? So that then raises serious questions or implications for thinking about alternative policy scenarios. Right? For example, is gender equality initiative that is financed by a rise in PSRB, public sector borrowing, um, is it compatible, right, with the rise in CAP, right? So, for example, the IMF, countries that operate under IMF conditionality will face limits on what is the allowable rise in PSRB, right? So, what about like private sector balance? What happens to that if you have an initiative that is financed through a rise in the PSBR? So, what are the implications of private deficit fuel growth for gender equality? So these are some of the kind of crucial implications that the modeling structure has in terms of thinking about concrete policy initiatives. Then finally, let me say a few words about the model specification and coercions. So the accounting structure, as you can probably hear, I've been very abstract in terms of explaining the model, but that's because it has to be spelled out at that level. The accounting structure really allows a great deal of flexibility in terms of developing models with country-specific details. This is, of course, our ultimate goal. So institutional categories or asset classes may be combined or disaggregated as depending on the availability of the data. You can disaggregate the production sector in many ways. You can construct, for example, like we've done in the modeling for Ghana and Tanzania, construct a non-capitalist on-account sector, or construct a synthetic care sector which provides for early childhood education. The price formation can be modeled in a variety of ways as a combination of markup pricing, pricing at cost, or in the case of countries, small open economies which are dependent on, say, one or two mineral exports or agricultural products, right, on given world market price. So the model actually is very flexible in terms of adapting to individual country institutional details as well as data availability. The basic rule of thumb when it comes to actually using this framework is to reduce the degree of complexity as much as possible, right? Keeping in mind the research question, like what is the specific policy initiative or set of initiatives that we are trying to assess, and the availability of data. Right. So that's why I'm spelling out the model structure in a very general term because it is meant to be specified like that so it can be adapted to different country and policy contexts. Okay. The novel features of the approach and from a macro level is that if you think about the research that has taken place in the post-Keynesian, gender-aware, post-Keynesian, Keynesian kind of modeling, this is very much in line with Onaran and, for example, one of the authors who have written quite a bit about the macro modeling of gender from a post-Keynesian angle. The only additional thing is the disaggregation and the micro part of our model, which is a substantial addition to the existing kind of theoretical framework. So the stock flow limits, right, on the basis of depth stocks, define a dynamic structure which is absent in the existing models, the post-Keynesian, the heterodox models in this. And last but not the least, the construction of this model for a whole country increases the quality of the macroeconomic information itself. So that is something that becomes evident when you check for the certain accounting consistencies that has to be met. So if your macroeconomic data that's collected by a national accounting agency does not avail that, then we can actually see it when we put it together within this comprehensive data frame, right? So the differences to the CGE model, again, most traditional CGE model knows completely the financials. The policy models for development assessment, they completely ignore that. They also introduce the ones that introduce sources and uses of funds, for example, the World Bank's MAMS model. They assume that investments is financed by saving out of a fixed amount of available liquidity and full employment of productive resources kind of follow. It's kind of built in to the linked into the model, So, I mean, you can see how the post-Keynesian approach that I'm spelling out is very different. So, under these kind of assumptions, a new government policy can be financed either from higher taxes or by crowding out saving, right, which would have gone to private investment. So almost by construction, the traditional CTE models imply that policies will be less attractive with respect to our approach. By definition, they have less room for manual, policy manual. That's the way the models themselves are constructed. Or otherwise, they will produce bad macroeconomic effects, right? Either that you're running into the government deficit, which causes a problem on the external front, which leads to, an exchange rate crisis, and which in turn has bad distribution kind of effects. Okay. How am I going to it's okay. So, okay, let me now turn to the micro block of the model. And just to again motivate the discussion, let me spell out the kind of the salient features of the standard approach. By the standard approach, what I'm referring to here is the standard CTE, the computable general equilibrium modeling approach to these issues. Okay, so in this kind of framework, really there are two axes of differentiating individuals and households into representative agents. That's what they do. They have representative agents. So they distinguish, say, between different types of labor factors. For example, educated female workers with a certain, say, college degree holders, right? Or unskilled male workers. So that will be specified as factors in the model. The other kind of differentiation is based on different types of households. For example, households that have children that need care, or rural households versus urban households, and so on. So that's the basic building modeling block is around this representative agents, right? Now, what do the representative agents do, and how do they do it, right? Well, the theoretical basis is that what they do is to supply labor to various sectors of the economy. They produce services such as childcare or cooking for their own consumption. They engage in leisure activities and demand consumer services and goods, all according to the principle of utility maximization. And a utility maximizing unitary household, which means that there are no conflicts between the members of the household, say between men and women. That's the assumption of the unitary household. The households operate as a collective entity in maximizing this collective benefit. Right? So that's the basic kind of framework that we use to for the modeling out framework, this representative agent assumption, together with the assumption of the utility maximizing unitary household. Now, this whole framework has been attacked by a lot of feminist economists, as many people in this room would know, how this has been attacked in standard Beckerian kind of framework. We shared several, of course, of the views and the critiques. Our focus really is on the representative household or worker methodology, especially its limitations that has been acknowledged when it comes to analyzing the impact of policy on inequality and poverty. So what are they? What's the problems there? The critical limitation when it comes to income inequality is that you can't really account for within group inequality. Now, most macroeconomic changes will generally generate changes in within group inequality and between group inequality. For example, it may generate inequality between men and women, but it will also generate inequality within the groups of men. The representative worker methodology can only go so far in detail as far as this how this within group inequality is completely ignored. Whatever representative agent estimates an average fact, right? So you don't have the distribution within that. So as it turns out, most of the empirical research on looking at the policy, the impacts of policy changes on household income inequality shows that most of the changes happens within and not across. So adopting this methodology is inadequate from a policy or impact assessment point of view because by assumption, it rules out a major source of change in inequality, within group inequality, how that changes, right? It completely ignores that. Now, the other problem, which is more evident when we think about the representative agents as representative households in the model, in the CGE model, right? Rural households, urban households. Because what you're modeling is the change in average income by construction, you really can't say anything about the incidence or depth of poverty, because that requires a knowledge about the distribution. So you can say, for example, how much average income for rural households would change, headed by, like, say, a skilled male worker. But you can't say anything about how much the poverty rate for that group would have changed, because that requires knowledge about the distribution of income within that. So again, that's not a very desirable feature from the point of view of, examining the policy impacts, so the impacts of doing impact assessment. So what is the alternative? The alternative is really to replace the representative agents with the representative sample of households. So you are operating not with just a few agents or the average effects, but you're modeling the entire distribution, and you're doing so by integrating representative sample survey into the model. So now what are the goals of our impact assessment? We want to look at the impact on subgroup means, right? That's something that the representative agents model also can do. In addition, we want to look at the distribution of earnings, like the Gini coefficient, say, for men and women. We want to look at how family income or expenditure inequality would have changed. We want to look at how household and caring work, distribution between employed and non-employed women, for example, how that would have changed, right? So policy changes should also be evaluated in terms of how they affect the least well-off. And that's what we do by the poverty impact assessment in the model, right? Including the impoverishing effects of time deficits also on this, right? Now, what's the basic approach in the modeling? What are the kind of underlying principles? There's too many details here that I can't really get into within the time that we have here. But really, we abandoned the utility maximizing unitary household framework. And the modeling approach could be thought of as a reduced form model of several of the social interactions model with heterogeneous agents, right? So the approach is computation and simulation-based modeling, similar to what, like, for example, Foley has discussed in his 2020 paper of a social interactions model. And the individuals and households are not optimizing machines within this framework, but they generally follow social norms or established patterns of behavior in a probabilistic fashion. So it's not a determined outcome that, say, because you are a woman living in a particular rural area of the country, having a certain level of education and having a certain number of dependent children would behave in a particular way or ways. It's determined in a probabilistic fashion. But according to how your peer group behaves, that's really the key. How does the peer group behave? How does the social interactions models experiences that? So we are capturing that using a computational approach here in the model. Okay, so individual impacts are determined by the criteria of statistical similarity. So that's the crucial, the conceptual tool in determining the outcomes. So the outcomes for individuals are subject to constraints and opportunities that they face, right? So specifically, individual level impacts are determined on the basis of statistical similarity, approximated by measures such as propensity scores or affinity scores. To operationalize the notion of constraints, we have variables that reflect, for example, the individual's living arrangements, responsibilities, location, etc. For opportunities, we use variables related to key demographics, labor market attributes, family wealth, etc. So individual outcomes are subject to constraints and opportunities, and it's a result of individuals following social norms or their peer group patterns in a probabilistic fashion. Okay, so that's a general description. Now I won't torture you with the, okay, so this is just what I said. Okay, this is the gory details of the engineering behind the model in a schematic fashion. I won't, torture you with what's going on here, but let me just describe in broad terms what's happening here in this slide. So the bunch of equations in the boxes on the left side gives us a predicted values for earnings from work, earnings from employment, and hours of employment for those that are actually employed and say those that are likely to be employed as a result of this policy initiative. Again, going back to the example of investing in public infrastructure. Right? So that's what the left side equations are giving us. But we use the predicted values only as an ingredient in our similarity formulas. The hours of employment, as well as the hours of household production, earnings, etc., they are drawn from the actual distribution in an iterative manner, reflecting the non-parametric and the computational nature of our method. Okay, so the right-hand side box kind of sums up the steps that I just described in a very summary fashion, in a less summarized fashion. So summing up, I mean, really our goal is to develop non-neoclassical, non-marginalist policy models to assess gendered outcomes or distributive outcomes generally. So the framework, for example, that I just sketched out could be used with appropriate modifications for other policy applications with a kind of a medium-term horizon, exchange rate evaluation, trade liberalization, or an employment guarantee program like in the mid-scale sense. So let me stop there and okay, so around the time, so we have time for discussion.
Thank you, Ajit, for this, very interesting presentation. I think we're giving lots of food thought, and then I hope that get some more. And then, okay, so now we're going on to the question. This was a very question. Please show. Yes, so.
Thank you, Ajit, for coming to NAM and to show us the last research on the Lab Institute. I think it's very interesting. And also, it's very clear the difference between neoclassical models, right? It's totally different, the approach. And what I want to ask you is, what triggers, or, I mean, first of all, Gennaro and he has calculated the multiplier effect. Right? I think this is the big macroeconomic impact. Let's see if that's correct what I'm saying. Yeah, the beginning of everything is the government expenditure, and that's a trigger for all the changes in the system, or what will be the trigger to analyze the changes in wages, the changes in employment, and poverty, and so on and so forth.
That's what I illustrated here. But the model can be used, for example, to study another kind of an effect. Suppose that, for example, the government decides to reduce the borrowing costs or subsidize the borrowing of female entrepreneurs to promote, like, female self-employment and economic autonomy. That could be built into the model. And that would be like going from the bottom to the top, because that in turn would make changes in the household balance sheet, which in turn can affect their consumption expenditure. It will have macroeconomic effects that feed back into the model. So, but in general, you're absolutely right. We use this as a tool for assessing changes in the government's fiscal stance. Or, in fact, it could be the monetary policy stance. That's an illustration that I was just giving by this example of, promoting female self-help groups or, self-employment schemes and so on. Yeah, but anyway, please carry on there.
But by any chance, do you remember the number of equations for the macro model and for the micro model? I mean, just to imagine what you have still wait to start programming and doing some.
Right. Well, we haven't counted the equations for the SFC version of the model yet, but we have counted the equations for the flow consistent method, which again is a SAM-based model. It doesn't have the stops in the modeling framework. And for the macro side, I want to say it's like 103 for the macro side alone.
So for many sectors.
Yeah.
And you have done this for the US just.
No, the macro model that I'm referring to was done for Ghana and Tanzania.
Yeah.
Right. The other ones that we have done are more based on input-output modeling, like the study we completed recently for Mexico, was looking at the, I don't know whether Alicia has seen this, but we recently completed a study for Mexico, looking at the extension of the school day for children and expansion of elder care. So government investments in that and the effects that it's have at the macro level on employment and earnings, that we use the Mexican input-output table, to make those predictions or make those assess those impacts. And then we use the time use survey and the income data, the survey to assess the time and income poverty impacts on that. So yeah, those kind of exercises have been done for a number of countries based on the input-output model. And yeah, what it started at the Lead Institute was during the time of Obama, assessing the Obama stimulus, or what was technically known as the American Reinvestment and ARRA Act. So it began with that, but later on, this method was used, integrating IO with microsimulation, used in a variety of contexts. In Turkey, a number of countries, the UN Women and UNDP adopted essentially the same methodology and did studies for a variety of things. Part of some of which we were involved, but some of which were completely conducted independently. Yeah. So the number of equations, but you use that in itself is not a problem given like today's computational, apparatus that's available to us.
That's another question I want to ask you. Duncan, is Duncan Foley the author of that paper? Who was,
Duncan?
Yeah. Yeah, it's Duncan Foley.
Duncan Foley, yes.
Yeah, the probabilistic approach.
Right.
Thank you.
Okay. Jessica, please.
Well, thanks for the presentations. My question is, over your perspective, what is the best form of financial, political, economic with quality gender? For maybe the taxes or the, in this case, if you think the taxes, so what are the implications for the people, for the household?
Right.
Sobre todo, for the famous, for the female, sorry. And the other question is, for example, how can be financed a political public for the game system or corresponsability, care corresponsability?
Sorry, I understand the question. But please go ahead, yeah.
¿En Spanish?
Ya,
En
español.
bueno, lo voy a decir en español. ¿Cómo puede ser financiada una política pública de corresponsabilidad de cuidados? También con deuda o con impuestos. For example, in the class, I have been studied to Minsky and the role that the state like employer of last resort. And my partners and I, with Dr. Alicia, the people discuss over the implications for the role to a state like employer, employer of last resort, and the difficult part for countries in America Latina that the central bank isn't sovereign, no tiene soberanía monetaria. Yeah.
Right. Well, let me first restate the issues that you raised to make sure that I understood the question correctly. The first point that you raised was taxes versus borrowing as a method of financing. Is that right? Okay, and what is like my position on that? Okay. Well, I think that I mean, if you're thinking I'm thinking borrowing. When you say borrowing, I'm also thinking of external borrowing, not just domestic borrowing, right? Given the challenges that are faced by most low-income and middle-income countries, I think when we're talking about financing for development, we have to talk about a combination of the two. That is domestic.
Sorry, would you repeat this?
No, I'm just saying that if we are thinking, given the financing needs, the size of the financing need, I mean, just to illustrate, right, there was a report by UNCTAD recently, and for 48 low-income and middle-income countries, they estimate that to achieve the goals so spelled out in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, by 2030, just the gender-related goals would require about 20% of the GDP of the collective of this particular country, right? In many countries for which we have done estimates for providing for public expenditures on early childhood education, the numbers that we come up with are roughly in the range of like 3 to 6% of GDP, just for providing quality childcare education, early childhood education. Right? So these are pretty large numbers, and it is hard for me to imagine how this can be done only through domestic financing or only through external financing. So I'm envisaging that this would probably require a combination of two. Right? Now, the question then boils down to what is actually the method of harnessing these different sources of finance. So again, this is a very complex topic, and it depends a lot on the particular country and the institutional context, by which I specifically mean the balance of forces politically, between the different groups, right? Where there is will and ability to raise revenues through progressive taxation domestically and through taxation of foreign capital and foreign financial flows, I would go for that as one of the major sources of finance. Now, the impact that such a kind of a strategy would have on the external balance, primarily on the hot capital flows, and whether that's a short-term question. And I think if people at the international multilateral institutions want to really support these initiatives in practice, instead of just by lip movement, they actually want to support it in practice, they can do many things. For example, there is ER reallocation, right? That could ease a lot of the external, external balance constraints that may be faced by our countries in the global south. Are they willing to do it? So that's what I'm saying. So it's a hard question to answer, but I would say, if you summarize, you'll need a combination of the two, of domestic and external one. Then you asked about public financing of expenditures for care responsibility. Is that Shivaji? No, care responsibility.
Yeah, sharing.
Sharing of care.
The care, correcto. The policies por las políticas para la corresponsabilidad del cuidado, o sea, cómo deberían de ser financiadas, porque entiendo que cuando hay políticas públicas que tienen como un eje transversal en el que ocupa educación, salud, empleo, entonces esas políticas se van como engranando para... Entonces, ¿cómo debe de ser como ese gasto público en estas políticas que al final se van a ir engranando para al final tener un sistema de cuidado?
Right.
Okay.
This is a very important issue, a very important issue. Let me say a couple of things. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind, in terms of the care responsibilities, is the famous 3 R's of, Diane Nelson, right? When it comes to the responsibilities, what feminist economists are campaigning for, are arguing for, is the reduction in the time to reduce. That's the first R. Then there's the recognition. Recognition is the first R, that the importance of this unpaid work for economic well-being and actually human well-being. The second is the reduce part, how we want to reduce the time spent on this. Then the third is the redistribution part, right? How to attain a more gender equitable division of household production responsibility. So the policies that, at least in my view, which will go to address these three R's, right, can be broadly thought of as improving, especially in low-income countries, especially in countries where there is a severe lack in rural infrastructure, which will be large parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which is where like about 70% of the global poor lives, right? So if you're really thinking about that population and their needs and the policy initiatives that we think about and how it relates to their needs, then investments in physical infrastructure have a big role to play. Road improvements, improvement in electric well systems, in water supply and all this. Now, the interesting thing about all these improvements is that, this is broadly related to how are we thinking about this fiscal space? Because often if you talk to the people in IMF or World Bank who does this modeling, they have a very narrow view, right? They say like, okay, investing in something like this, how does that affect your budget deficit? Right? That's all they look at. But over the long run, we should recognize that investments in public capital, if you like, in public infrastructure, will translate into gains for private enterprises themselves or for other social and health purposes, right? Affecting health outcomes. If you have a good road, then, for example, there are studies on Bangladesh which shows how the improvement in rural roads have played a role in reducing maternal mortality, the mortality that women face while giving child. Because you can actually get on the road and get to a public health center, rather than going in the bullock cart or the old method of production, of transport, right? So these kind of initiatives that we're talking about, so when we're looking at, if you take a narrow view of fiscal sustainability and define the impacts very narrowly, not counting like this externalities, if you like, right? But they are real and they are there. And what part of what we are arguing for, this is not particularly in our work, but in the broader document, what we are arguing for is a broadening of the definition of fiscal space. And what does that mean? The metrics used to assess that. Instead of thinking about it narrowly in terms of depth sustainability, where our capacity equation is what's generally used for debt sustainability, right? The interest rate being lower than the growth rate. But yeah, so in terms of the public policies, that the physical infrastructure is very important. Investing in early childhood education is very important. Social provisioning of childcare, they're very important initiatives. So broadly speaking, we are really talking about, what to use Amartya Sen's term, investing in human capabilities, in education, in health. And this is not just in the needs of women. They're 50% of the population. And you can't have this just for women. So we are talking broadly about development, right? And how to finance development. It's not really a gender issue if you think about it that way, right? So the third question, I think was, I hope this kind of broadly addresses the question about what should be the kind of public initiatives for care responsibilities and their reduction. The third question, or the question that you raised, let me start by saying what I thought you said. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Was I translated wrong? Sorry. Whether you translated right, you can't be absorbed of responsibility here. About the right. About the ELR, right? The employer of last resort, and what are the general financing, the limits for financing that, especially in countries like ours, where the central bank independence is there and we can face that kind of constraint. Now, again, this is an important and crucial question when it thinks about actual implementation of policy. One proponents of the large schemes are, as you probably know, followers of Minsky, the MMT school, the modern monetary theory school, which does not think that any such constraints exist in any real way. What is really lacking is the political will and the push, so to speak, from the civil society organization to implement something like this. They argue that the financing constraint to this is actually very limited. It's not that it won't have any impact, but a lot of the times they will be self-financed in the sense that the new employment and the multiplier effects will generate tax revenue. Just like many of the gender equality initiatives that we are talking about will do, right? If you think about generally our economies are characterized by widespread underemployment and unemployment and widespread underutilization of productive resources. We don't have in any meaningful way, any supply constraints, so to speak. So enough effective demand will stimulate economic activity and employment and income generation, which will in turn have a positive effect on government tax revenue. So to some extent, initiatives like the ELR scheme or ELR again depends on the scale, depending on how many people you actually have to employ and what they actually do, right? So it will depend on that. But one school of thought is that believes that I'm not in complete agreement with this school of thought. As we discussed last night, and almost every time that we meet, we come back to this topic and discuss it. But someone like Ignacio or others will probably be able to speak about what specific Mexican context in terms of the central bank governance and the limits on monetary policy. But I just want to say that these limits are often often more political than strictly economic. The sense of affordability of a scheme like the ELR or the other, gender equality enhancing initiatives that we are talking about. So that's broadly my take on that. I don't know whether that answers that addresses the concern, but yeah. I'm sorry, I can't speak specifically to the Mexican context, but I'm not that knowledgeable about the Mexican macroeconomic, especially monetary policy, central bank policy.
But this is not that different from other plain concepts.
Okay.
So now we have questions from us.
Thanks. Well, I have some points here. The first one is, I am in a chat where there are many feminist Latin American, they're not economists, it's a group of Claxo. Claxo, maybe you have heard, no, it's the social science for of Latin America, and I am in a feminist group there. And when Claudia Sheinbaum was selected, everybody told me, "Oh, is she a feminist?" I don't know. I don't know if she's a feminist or not, because you are going to see if she is feminist. You are going to see that in the fiscal budget. And that's the key to say that if you have a woman very intelligent, very good PhD and whatever, you are going to see that in the fiscal budget. And I don't know if it hasn't been approved, but if you compare how was the last 6 years, especially the chapter 13, where there is all the, where it was gender, I think that the last president, it was in front of a feminist policy for many things. One of the things that he told her when he arrived, AMLO, he said that grandmothers must take care of their grandchildren. So,
for free.
okay, I am working, and so I have to take care of my grandchildren. And who is going to give my salary? So I have to stop my work, and then I have to go and take care of my grandchildren, which are very nice, but I wouldn't be 24 hours with them. Okay, I reject that. Well, so the other thing is we know, because I was invited by in Mujeres, Women Institute, and now it's going to be secretary they work with United Nations, CEPAL, United Nations, PNUD, no? All the care system. And just 1 year before the government finished, well, I told them, well, what happened? I know that the plan of the care system is in the Senado, the center, but the problem is that I don't know how the Secretary of Finance said that we don't have money to have a care system. The other thing, and that is related with the next, you in the last chart, you say exchange rate, trade negotiation, and employment of the research. One of the traps that most of the Latin American countries, but most of like Sri Lanka and other countries, is that we have the debt external travel. And for many years, since I was a kid, I have been working with the external debt. And external debt is even, that's why you just can't achieve the goals of the Agenda 2030. You just can't have the Agenda 2030 because the cost, the financial cost of the external debt is very high. And you just, it is incredible. In 1982, we arranged with the principal banks our, we made pre-renegotiation that is made in Mexico and also in Brazil and Argentina. And that the external debt was reduced, interests were reduced. So it was like, well, they know that we just couldn't continue paying without investments in education, in health, and in water. I love that you put that word water, because it is very important, the access of water, especially in the rural areas. So one of the problems, if you really want to have feminist policy or gender equality, or it doesn't matter how, because gender equality, it has to be also with to have a better life for all the families and all the people that are in the household or whatever. But one of the principal things that we have to arrange is the financial cost, the financial cost of external debt. And for example, in the African countries, most of them, they have a lot of credits from China. It has improved a lot, the external debt of China, but at the same time, it is very different the way the Chinese work with those governments. Because at least you have a train, at least you have an airport, at least you have a port. That's a different way. It's not because I love the Chinese, no. It's because they are at the imperial as not like colonial countries. But I think it's a different way. But the problem is, for example, for Mexico, is also that cost. And that's why you have this trampa, this trap, and also, and besides that is the austerity. So it is very difficult to have a gender equality policy if we don't arrange all these macroeconomic variables that you just can't. No, even if you are, how to say, if you want to improve the wealth in your society, I think the first thing that you have to take is to arrange that. So you will have, especially a feminist gender policy. And other thing that I think is very important, and maybe you can, I would like your opinion about all these program that we have with the last government, and I think it is going to continue, is the social transfers. The social transfers is because you don't have employment.
Right.
No, so we have for the viejitos, the old people, which I agree with that. I agree also with the scholarship for but others, it's a lot of corruption in that. So, and you're going to continue, no? So there are families that they have about 3, 4, and 5 of these social, let's say, social.
Policy.
So, no, it is, you have no, it's transfer. You have, the thing that I want to put on the table is that there are families that they have around between 3 and 4 social transfers. The mother, the grandmother, la viejita, no, el viejito.
Yeah.
The mother because he's single mother. The little children, and that means also that you must have more children instead of stop the children then yourself. And those social transfers will be better if you go, for example, the transfer for the old ones is for your medicines because you don't have a health system for everybody. So I think that these problems, at least in Mexico, and I don't know if in other Latin American countries, if they have this, how to say, these social transfers. I think they have in Brazil. In Argentina, well, they stopped up. They have with Kirchner and the employment, the program that Hegel and Randall advised when it was Kirchner. Well, it was good to improve your economy, but you just continue to that. And one of the only things that many people have told me is that salary, ¿cómo se llama? El salario unitario, el de el salario básico universal. The basic, the social, universal basic salary. But many people has already told me, it's very important to have, renta básica universal.
Universal basic income.
The basic income, because we are having a transformation in our economy. We are going to the digital economy. No? So many employment is going, you're not going to have. Just yesterday, I just finished a paper, and then I said, oh, no, I have to translate now in English. And they told me, no, you just go to the ChatGPT, you put everything, and in seconds, it was in English. It's just unbelievable. So I don't have to make that work. Of course, I have to read it, But so there are many employments that are going just to disappear. So in this digital economy, why it is very important, and why it is very important the IA, IA, because you need education, and if you improve your education, you are going to use IA to improve other things. You don't have to be, IA is going to say, no vamos a quedarnos sin empleo without employment. No, you have to do it. And so I think that these social transfers, we must see that most of them is because there's no employment and the people are very happy. They are really very happy. Even the clase media, they're very happy to take that. It's about $150 every month, something like that. Of course, many people just take that to go to have breakfast with their friends. No, others are for their medicine. Because it wasn't, you don't have to give a salary or a social transfer to people of high income. That was, you must have a better policy to do that. Well, sorry to.
No, it's fine.
But I think we can discuss for that discussion. Sorry.
Well, I mean, this is broadly in the nature of, comments and, issues and, that, how do I put this? I mean, as I was describing the work that I presented just now with like more of the engineering work, right? About how to assess the trade-offs of different policies rather than talking about what are the specific policies themselves. So I was using it more as an illustration of a modeling framework to assess, to do this assessment. Now, the two companion papers to my paper, to our paper, one written by Stephanie Sacchino and the other by Eileen Grable, addresses respectively. Eileen's paper is really looking at how external borrowing constraints can be relaxed, can be reframed, can be re-articulated to deal with the external financing constraint that you are mentioning. So I know that probably you know Eileen. Do you know Eileen?
Oh, yes, you do.
Yeah, so shoot her an email and she'll send you the paper. So, which is a companion paper to my paper, which talks about the.
Seguino, your friend, sorry.
Sorry?
Seguino.
Oh, so Stephanie, that's what I thought. These are all your comrades. So, Stephanie, her paper is talking about the domestic macro level resource mobilization and the different methods that can be employed, right? Because the standard approach is very restrictive. Standard, I mean, again, IMF World Bank approach, right? What are they talking about? They're either talking about expenditure or tax reallocation, that you want to fund, like, women's maternal health clinics, okay, reallocate from, like, something to that, right? It's very limited in, or they will just look at, like, can you raise taxes on a particular class of goods, right? But I think what Stephanie is doing is, like, looking at it a more broad perspective. Like, for example, the monetary policy, right? What kind of monetary policy initiatives can be used to enhance employment outcomes for women? And whenever we think about the employment effects on women, these are always there are effects on men too. And often any effort to boost aggregate demand and to stimulate economic activity will benefit both, right? So that's the nature of the most of the initiatives. Now, certain sectors, if you, for example, if you're thinking about, like, employment, in early childhood education, expanding, childcare for kids below the age of 5. That sector is labor share is predominantly female. So, and it's also very labor intensive, right? So in terms of, like, the linkages, like, so direct effect will be that there will be a bump in female employment. So the female share of employment would go up. But then there's an indirect effects through the linkages, right? So because it's not just the nurseries that you're building, you need raw materials to go into the production of the centers, running them, and the later, down up the supply chain, the ripple effects that is created. That means jobs for men too. So most of this initiative are this kind of. So she talks about, like, a number of initiatives that at the domestic level beyond the usual IMF World Bank make of domestic macro policy initiatives that can be harnessed for this space, for expanding the fiscal space. Again, what we are challenging, and this is like something that's very much all three of us are key teams. So I together with the person who was the coordinator for this project. You perhaps know her too. That is Anuradha Seth. She is the macroeconomic policy advisor for UN. Anuradha Seth. Anu Seth. Yeah. So anyway, but what I was saying was that one of the main points that we were trying to hammer home, and in the next stage of this work, which is really to work with individual countries in terms of thinking through the initiative and then passing it through our meat grinder, the model, to assess the trade-offs of different initiatives, is to drive home the point that you need to take a more broader view of economic development rather than just looking at GDP or debt to GDP ratio. Then you need to look at the external effects of investing in education and health and how that has effects on growth and productivity. Right? So if you just look at, like, in terms of, like, the discretionary government spending, right, and it's what impact it has on public debt, and then look at the debt to GDP ratio, which is what narrow-metrics are doing, they're ignoring the long run and the cumulative impact that comes out of this kind of expenditures or investment which impact upon. But ultimately, from the point of view of most national governments and the IMF, what is also required is that some of these discretionary expenditures gets reclassified, not as social spending, but as actually public capital investment expenditure. Right? So then they come out of that definition of how you define the current the current balance of the government sector or the external sector. Because if you're classifying it as investment, then you account for it in a different way. So that requires a serious rethinking on the part where challenging really what is, what is the outcome that we want to look at? Are we looking at like this GDP growth? Are we looking at human capability and human development? It requires a reorientation, I think, that how far the national governments and international multilateral institutions will go in that direction remains to be seen. Finally, in terms of the social transfers that you mentioned, again, like I have to say that I'm a little bit ignorant about. I know some of the schemes but I know that after AMLO came to power, he introduced a number of other social transfer schemes, and I agree in the sense that a lot of it is necessitated by the lack of job creation, and that's like putting a band-aid on the problem, on a very big wound. That the very basic problem is the inability to create decent jobs, well-paying jobs where people can, so that's the basic problem. But that goes beyond like what I'm supposed to discuss here today. But I do recognize that is, and the kind of like, perverse incentives that is built into it. And sometimes the deleterious effect that this has on like, women's employment and labor market out, like giving money to have kind of creating perverse incentives to have more kids, which will keep you out of the employment, situation for even long, right? So, I mean, this is followed also by very conservative social policy regimes, like for in Turkey, they have a similar policy initiated by Erdogan to build like rebuild the true traditional Muslim family. So they have some transfers to women if they stay home, right? So that's, and which is not a huge amount, it's a small amount. So there is employment created, productive employment created, or other opportunities or self-employment created. They would definitely earn more money. And of course, the whole gender norms and the whole balance, the redistribution of care work, right? Improving the bargaining power of women, all that would change. Instead of, throwing some crumbs at them, some pittance in terms of like housewife allowance, So it not only reinforces very conservative and reactionary, to put it bluntly, gender norms, this kind of social transfers. They also don't really help us move towards the goals of women's economic empowerment or substantive gender equality. They create perverse incentives, the opposite direction. So that way I share your view about the kind of, these are actually anti-feminist transfers, you could say,
Yes,
in a certain sense.
yes, I never thought it was a very conservative view, but I think yes, it is. Another thing that, for example, in now I'm very close to people that work about Japan, and there's a wonderful book that has organized Diane Nelson. I think it's in Rockledge. It's about women. Yeah, Japan. She organized a session in a Japanese university, and I made a cooperation between Japanese women and Mexican women, and also using the global gender gap, the boss. And it is very interesting in that paper because, for example, Mexico is in the first levels of in gender equity, especially in participation. And Japanese is very less than between 10 and 20 places of the and Japanese in the 120 place. But that doesn't mean when you compare education or you compare participation in the labor market, the macro are terrible. It's a symmetry between Mexico and Japan. But besides that, one of the things that also is that how women are used in that economic cycle.
Economic cycle, yes.
Because when the Japanese between the two world wars and later, the woman, Japanese woman has to work to reconstruct their country. When it was a Japanese miracle, then women if you want to have, if you want to get married, in that moment you are out of the labor market, and more if you want to have a child. They don't have a care system. You don't see a care system for women that are very, most of them are in the university, or they are very high education skills, whatever. So this is interesting because the labor force, the labor woman, is my conclusion that it depends in the economic cycle. When continuing. Because, for example, there's another book about Nancy, there are two Nancy's, Nancy Ford and Nancy Fraser. Nancy Fraser said that the feminist movement, especially in Latin America, makes the work of the neoliberalism. Because during that, at the end of the 17th and all the 80s, so during the lost decade in Latin America, women went to the labor market because the salary of the principal reduced, so you have to go and work. And that gave a big change in that traditional family, you know? And so she said, well, if that woman, he said, the feminist movement fight to participate in the labor market. But the problem is that women make the work for the neoliberalism. Women wouldn't have gone to the labor market. That won't have been a big violence in society because you need that income. So they're very interesting, but I think that one of the things that I learned in this is that the participation of women in the labor market and also that gender equality depends of the economic cycle. And of course, it depends of the macroeconomic policies, the fiscal and the monetary policy, and more in a globalized world. No?
I may come to broad agreement with
question.
So thank you for your lecture. During your lecture, you stressed the differences, the methodological differences of your model against the traditional model. Especially you stressed that you use a representative sample instead of a representative agency. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, especially what do you mean by that? And also, when you said that you are not assuming an individual that is rational or completely rational, but that has a probabilistic approach that follows some norms, some social norms. How can you introduce that into your model, I mean, methodologically? And second, I have a question related with the discussion that we were having earlier about that kind of variables that can be measured in your model. You have macro variables and micro variables at the individual level or the household level. And you also include, for example, poverty or inequality. But they are mainly like monetary variables or variables that can be translated to monetary values. And for example, if we want to account for the external benefits of this policy, can those be included into your model? For example, if we want to measure empowerment, women's empowerment, but we don't have a monetary measure of that. But maybe we can translate that in a monetary measure. I don't know if that is possible beyond, for example, employment or earnings or that kind of variables? Can we include like women's empowerment or something like that, that it is also claim, it is all the time claimed that is one of the main advantages of these kind of policies? And my third question is about, I'm just curious about it. And when we read some important authors like Claudia Goldin, she says that one of the main policies in women advancement was the introduction of contraceptive pills, for example. And that is not exactly a very expensive policy, but it has had very important implications in terms of work and female participation in the labor market. Can that be modeled in your framework, that kind of policy?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a set of very difficult questions. And I hope I can, go some way to, I mean, some of them are like perhaps what was lost in the explanation. I was trying to condense many things into like a short presentation. And for those of us of a certain age in this room, telegraphic way, I don't know if conveying something in a telegraphic fashion, the telegram, as opposed to the email and you know what I'm talking about, right?
Instagram.
Telegram. Yeah. Telegram. Yeah, it's a telegram. Yeah. As opposed to the SMS, right? Text message. Because of the telegraphic way certain things were said. But yeah, but the first question, if I may start from there, is representative sample versus representative agents, right? What does that mean? That's what you're asking. So what does it mean to communicate the march? Well, remember that this is a model that has a macro component and a micro component, right? So in the macro component, we have a set of equations, say, right, which will determine the levels of employment, levels of output, external balance, etc. Now, there are certain what we call it linkage variables which connect these macro outcomes to micro outcomes. The example that I used in the presentation was changes in employment and earnings. The traditional approach is like to take the change in employment, right? And say you have female and male shares in employment. So how would that change? Look at that, right? And then in terms of the earnings, they will have the average, just again an example, average woman's earnings as compared to average men's earnings. Right? So that will be a representative agent kind of way of thinking about this microeconomic outcomes. What do I mean by that? So how is that different from the representative sample approach? Right? Representative sample approach, what we are doing is like to take this macroeconomic impact, right? So let's just for the sake of illustration, let me talk about the employment impact. Right? So the macroeconomic employment impact, right? Remember, our macro model is multi-sectoral, meaning that it's not just one single macroeconomy, but a macroeconomy that is dissected into like a few sectors, right? So really, the outcome then, in terms of the change in employment, you can think about it as a matrix, right? So you have changes in each industry, and you have changes in, say, each occupation type. So it's an industry occupation matrix of changes in employment. Okay. So once we have that, then the representative agent, the representative agent model is taking something like that is computing what the average change is. In our model, what we are doing is taking this matrix, the industry occupation matrix of employment changes, and then through a simulation and a computational model, determine which individual in the representative sample will end up getting these jobs. Who are the individuals who are likely to get the job and what are going to be their likely earnings? So that's the basic difference between the representative agent approach and the representative sample approach. So here we are wanting the changes for the whole population.
So it's not an average effect.
No,
You assign a probability to.
for
each
every individual, exact in the representative sample. Yeah. The second question that you were asking was about how can you, what is the contrast between the utility maximization, which you described as rational behavior, and social norms. First, I have to say that I disagree with you about the use of the term rational, about the rational behavior, because
Let's drop.
no, because the view of rationality that actually Herbert Simon, a Nobel laureate in economics, he talks about the difference between what he calls as procedural rationality and substantive rationality, right? So Simon argues that what is important in understanding economic reality is procedural rationality rather than just substantive rationality. Again, think about in the example of the utility maximization problem, what would be the two ways of applying these abstract concepts of rationality to this problem? In the substantive rationality case, the substance of the problem is maximizing utility. That's represented by the constraint optimization problem, right? Which we are all familiar from our undergraduate mind. So that's the substance of it. And then the rules of behavior that the agent is supposed to follow to do that optimization is really the actions of choice within that context. So that is the example of a substantive rationality where the goal is substance is utility maximization. What Simon is saying is procedural rationality is that actual consumption decisions by individuals are based on procedural rationality, meaning they make reasonable decisions given limited ability for computation, limited time, and social norms, and etc. Right? So that's the difference between the so both are rational behavior. Both are rational behavior. It's just that one follows a different kind of rationality. So in our model, the computational model that we have is actually following this principle of procedural rationality. Okay. Okay, again, going back to the employment example, I can illustrate the functioning of that, how that actually works, right? To give you a real, more intuitive understanding of what that is. Okay, so we generate this matrix of industry and occupation, the employment changes, and say we want to find out among the potential women who can get such a job, right? How are we going to figure that out, right? So that's where it's done by a non-parametric modeling using similarity measures, either the propensity score or affinity score, right? Which is really a measure of how a statistically similar person, how statistically similar two individuals are. So there are different things that go into judge that similarity. Your age, for example, your employment status, your living arrangements, so what type of family you are in, what type of racial or ethnic background do you belong to, right? All this is going into the construction of that similarity. So whether you are actually in our simulation, whether you are considered as somebody who will enter employment, will depend on how close you are in terms of that similarity measures to somebody like you who is already in employment.
It's like a propensity score.
Exactly, it's a propensity score match. Actually, what we are doing is a hot taking based on affinity scores. But affinity score and propensity score is similar. So in conceptually, the actual computational formulas are different. So that's how we are thinking about the probabilistic for people following probabilistically the social norms. Okay? Because what we are actually judging is how similar are you to your peer group, and if so, are you likely to engage in this particular type of content to take up a job that has become available. Right. So that's how we determine that. Then your other question was about external effects of policies to create or to advance gender equality, right? So if, and you ask me whether the model that I just sketched out can capture those external effects, right? So if by external effects you mean externalities, then it is not. Like, for example,
Social benefits,
the,
probably.
so, I mean, that, so our model, first want to be clarified that the model is not in its current version, is not set up to model externalities, external effects. In the standard public economics also that we don't capture. Then the other question is about how does this broadly relate to broad notions of women's economic empowerment, and can we have a monetary measure of women's empowerment? And you can perhaps, but I don't want to do that. I don't really do that. The standard kind of metrics actually that are used in most of the literature in terms of like women's, economic empowerment or equality, gender equality in economic sphere. The basic variables that are used there are differences in employment rates. So what's the employment rate for men versus women? Right? So that's one metric. The other metric that's most widely used is gap in earnings, the gender disparity in earnings.
But those are like traditional measures.
Those are traditional measures. So that's what we are capturing in our model. Then the other one that's often used is like the occupational segregation rate. Right? So those things again can be captured in our model. The other variable that is often used is the difference in gender poverty rates, income or consumption. Again, that can be captured within our model. Another indicator that's used is the gender disparity in the division of care or household work. Again, because we integrate household production into our model, you can track that. So those are the kind of, I would say variables that at least the model in its current version is capable of tracking rather than, very perhaps aspects which are more difficult to capture.
Autonomy,
Right, that's not there.
economic independence.
No, not things like that.
Okay, so is there any further questions that you would like to?
You ask, how can you measure women empowerment, right?
For example, that can be included in the model.
That's what she was at.
What are the outcomes instead of female employment or
Right,
earning gaps,
right.
something that is more intangible?
What's the definition of empowerment, women empowerment?
I don't know.
Well, I was just saying that,
Well,
there can be a bunch of indicators that is traditionally used, and I was saying that many of those indicators can be.
Participation in the labor market.
Right, that's what I was saying, employment rate, right, and the gap in employment rate.
Now, at the sense, the terms as well,
Right.
Not only participation in the economic sector, but also in politics and.
Yes.
democracy and sport, freedom.
Right, but that's not in the macro model.
But that can be, if not measured quantitatively, you can take, sort of quantitative technique to figure out, how to get.
Right.
I'm not saying that this is something that easy to, to fit in the mind.
Yeah, that would be a different
But it
model.
would be different model, or perhaps a little bit different twist to the mind. Yeah. All right. So I think we had enough, no? Enough ideas. Enough ideas.
I'm very, very
you know,
patient, and thank
you know.
you very much. I know that you are on vacation.
Yeah.
You came here to
Wow,
have discussion.
that's an advantage of having a friend like Ajit, we were classmates in New York, and then we can share lots of things, and we continue. So we continue discussing things during his stay here. We've been discussing, or actually, he has not left at all, because we've been discussing. So we have lots of ideas, and then thanks Ajit for such an inspiring and interesting talk. And I think, most of it is not all about him. Look at your papers and research, and then we will continue, of course, with the things and discuss them. I'm looking forward for, the next visit in the future. We can perhaps come and, have a,
Explanation.
yeah.
Sorry. Expectation.
No, because the expectation. Because there are lots of things. I mean, of course, I have lots of questions that I would like to discuss with you, but about time. And in particular, I see, the sort of dialectic between informality and informal market. And, I mean, because the countries that we mentioned that, you conducted research, right? Are characterized by, very high rates of informality. Yeah. Like 8% or 9%, whatever, rates of informality. And of course, this kind of, strategies or initiatives will impact informality and perhaps, I wonder whether, through these kind of, initiatives, informality can be reduced and turn into formality, and that will just contribute to expand fiscal space and so forth. But on the other hand, assume that happens, through this kind of policy or initiative, informality is reduced and fiscal expansion, the space is expanding as a result of, bringing some people into the formal market, that can be taxed.
Right.
Wouldn't that postpone, which is the key issue in many countries such as Mexico, but and to be sure, not only in Mexico, but other countries, like African countries or even some Asian countries, meaning, namely, a deep tax reform, which is, something that has been postponed in Mexico for over half a century. Caldo was here in the 1960s, hired by the Mexican government to conduct a study as to how to go about a tax reform, and then, he produced this study, and nothing happened afterwards. So we've been waiting. I mean, the best way for me to really achieve, a greater fiscal space, the root tax reform, But how can you achieve tax reform if the world is surrounded by fiscal paradise? I mean, if you increase, the tax, the marginal tax rate of taxation, the marginal rate of taxation, then you might end up with capital flights going to the fiscal paradise. So it's got to be a globalized sort of deal with this kind of problem. Anyway, so I'm just mentioning this because what you presented today is very inspiring, and lead us to think perhaps some of research lines, some lines of research will come about as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.